This episode is brought to you by Marantz Model 40N, ISA's Smart Amplifier of the Year. The most musical sound, simplified.
The Sonos AMP is a small streaming amplifier with an HDMI ARC input, and we only have to add loudspeakers to it. I connected the speakers that you see behind me, the Darko.Audio Silver 100 7G Limited Edition. Now, the Sonos AMP in Europe sells for €799. That's right in the middle of Bluesound territory. So you might want to know, like, how does the Sonos AMP compare to the slightly more expensive Bluesound Powernode and the slightly cheaper Bluesound Powernode Edge? Let's find out. Now, the great thing about ordering from Sonos directly is we get 100 days to decide for ourselves if we like this thing in our own home. And if I don't, I can send it back for a full refund. So that makes it super easy for us to listen for ourselves. On loudspeaker output power from the Sonos AMP, we get 125 watts per channel. Now, as many of you probably already know, the Sonos AMP integrates like a bajillion streaming services. But I think many listeners nowadays will either be using a native streaming service app with AirPlay, or they're using Spotify Connect. I think the days of Sonos users making full use of the app and the integrations, using the S2 app's menu system to access music, are possibly on the way out. Of course, one of this amp's major draw cards is its HDMI ARC input, which you don't find on the Sonos 5 or the Sonos One. You do get it on the soundbars that Sonos make. We'll come back to that later. But the Sonos AMP is a great way to get streaming and HDMI ARC into your life. You just have to add your own loudspeakers. And to that end, there is also a subwoofer output on the back of the Sonos AMP. And then when we engage that, the software inside the amp, obviously low pass is the sub output, and then high pass filters, the loudspeaker output. So we get the benefits of high pass filtering on our mains loudspeakers. Now, you probably heard me crap on about that before in our best of 2021 video. So if you don't know what those benefits are, I suggest you watch that video. But in that video was the Bluesound Powernode. So now we're into, yep, you guessed it, side-by-side comparisons. Now, this Sonos AMP, it sounds big, it sounds bold, it's got dynamics aplenty. But next to the Bluesound Powernode, so the more expensive Bluesound, it just doesn't quite go as deep as the Bluesound. It isn't quite as taut or as textured either. But up top in the uppermost frequencies, so the treble basically, we notice that the Sonos AMP isn't the most refined listen when sat next to or heard soon after the Bluesound Powernode. But in isolation, you probably wouldn't notice it. But in this side-by-side comparison situation, we do notice that the Sonos AMP lacks the refinement that the Powernode gives us. And the Powernode also gives us, and this is probably a slightly larger difference, it gives us an extra dose of clarity, of transparency, top to bottom. Now, I've said that I don't think these differences are night and day or anything else that other people write on the internet, but I do think, well, in fact, I know you would hear these differences at a high street dealer, because I did this exact demo this week. In filming some B-roll for another video we just made, I went to Hi-Fi Clubben in Berlin, my local store, and they had the Powernode and the Sonos AMP. And just for shits and giggles, I asked them to A/B it. And I hear there exactly what I hear here, in that, there isn't quite the sort of shimmer in the top end of the Sonos AMP that we get from the Bluesound Powernode. So know that if you want the best sounding amp, you want the Powernode. It's an extra €100, maybe €200 now. I don't know, I think the street price can vary depending upon where you shop. But I think it's worth the money to spring for the Powernode on sound quality alone. However, I will qualify this by saying that if you think your speakers already have enough sort of microdynamic flair or enough sparkle, or they lean already towards sort of a brighter sound, then you might find the Sonos amp the more copacetic match. Now the differences between the Sonos amp and the Powernode Edge are just as small really, but they're slightly different that I hear with the Monitor Audio loudspeakers, in that I think in the low end, the Sonos amp with these speakers sounds a bit fuller and fleshier than the Edge. But the Edge really for me wins out with its sort of sense of ambience and air and I guess superior layer separation as well. Next to the Edge, the Sonos amp can sound a bit congealed. But you might be thinking, hang on a minute though, John, with the Sonos amp we get over 100 watts per channel, and with the Bluesound Powernode Edge we only get 40 watts per channel. And you would be right. So if you're rocking high efficiency speakers or higher efficiency speakers, like Zoo, like JBL, like some Klipsch, then I would definitely go for the Powernode Edge if we're talking about sound quality here. But if your speakers are more insensitive, so if you've got, say, like an 84 dB pair of stand mounts, then I would be more inclined to go with the Sonos amp because it has that extra oomph on tap that the Powernode Edge doesn't. Even though the Powernode Edge sounds, it sounds, what's the word here? More vibrant, more vital. Well, that's the right, maybe punchy is the right word. It does sound more than 40 watts per channel to me. But I do notice that when I go back to the amp, the Sonos amp, there's just a more sort of mature sense of control of the low end on more inefficient speakers. Now, the thing is, the Monitor Audios here, they kind of sit in the middle ground. They're 87 dB according to the manufacturer. So if you're in that kind of situation, sort of a middle of the road sensitive loudspeaker where either the Sonos amp or the Bluesound Powernode Edge or the Bluesound Powernode will be good enough for you in terms of power output and low frequency control, then you're probably going to want to take a closer look at the functionality of each piece, because I think that those variations will have more of an impact on how people buy than sound quality alone. Before we dig into those functional differences, I've got a recommended album for you. This is from, I think, a sort of house techno DJ. Don't let that put you off, because this album isn't like that. It is a compilation. It is mixed. It's by a chap called Jimmy Van M. Now, Jimmy Van M made one of the best sort of techno house DJ mixes I've ever heard. The Bedrock DJ Mix CD, or double CD. But this is not it. This came out 5 years later on Balance. This, I think, was released in Australia, first of all. This is a 3 CD set, but it is absolutely not bleepy bloopy or duffy or anything like that. There is the first disc, which is a down-tempo mix, which features things like Boards of Canada, The Irresistible Force, The Future Sound of London and their alter ego, Amorphous Androgynous, and Bill Laswell, and a whole bunch of other people. It's a fascinating listen, all blended together. I would recommend you buy this album. I think it's only available on CD actually at the moment. I don't think it's on streaming services, but I could be wrong. But I recommend you listen to it just for that first section alone. And then there's a mid-tempo CD and then an up-tempo CD, which is more sort of house and techno. So it covers all bases. So yeah, I recommend you go and listen to that if you want a sort of gateway drug into electronic music. Now, both the Bluesounds and the Sonos amp have line level analog inputs, so we can connect pretty much any analog source. Now the Sonos AMP has twin RCA sockets, but the Bluesounds use a 3.5mm socket. Now if you're thinking, oh, well I much prefer the RCAs, that's going to sound way better, think again. Because I did some extensive listening with my Rega Planar 8 turntable and its Autophon 2M Black cartridge, all feeding an iFi Zenfono phono stage, and connected those in turn to each of these amplifiers. And I made sure I used the same type of cable for each of those connections, even though the terminations are different. Now, what I found out was quite interesting, because on the Bluesound Powernode, the clarity advantage that it has over the Sonos AMP is wider than ever when we're talking about analog sources. I know the Sonos AMP can stream that analog source to another Sonos device anywhere in the house. I'm not even sure if the Bluesound can do that. I just don't know, actually. But to me, the Bluesound Powernode just sounded so much better with an analog source than the Sonos AMP. But it's not just that. My turntable setup through the Sonos AMP sounds tonally washed out compared to the Powernode and the Powernode Edge. And it gets a bit worse actually for the Sonos AMP, because its sort of internal DSP processing, maybe because it does that sort of elsewhere streaming, it introduces a full 1 second delay. And what that means for vinyl playback is that we lower the needle, we see the needle hit the record's groove, and then we hear it, just like that. That doesn't happen with the Bluesound. Everything is very much real time. Now this is an important factor for me. I'm very sensitive to this kind of thing. I can't abide it when I just see the needle drop and then don't hear it till a full second later. No, absolutely no, deal breaker for me. But the Bluesounds, plural there, their 3.5mm analog input also doubles as a mini TOSLINK input, a digital input. So we can introduce a CD player if we wanted to, or a games console. The Sonos Arc doesn't have any digital inputs beyond the HDMI ARC input. And whilst we're talking about that, the Sonos Amp's HDMI ARC input is just HDMI ARC. It's not the eARC that we get on the Bluesounds. Now, eARC doesn't really bother me at all, because I'm not a home theater kind of person. This isn't a home theater channel. So please bear that in mind if you're about to leave a comment about it below. However, I know that some of you, are into home theater, and what eARC means is that the bandwidth of that connection can support uncompressed 5.1, 7.1, and it'll also do Dolby Atmos. But one of my favorite features of the Sonos AMP, being a bit of a lazy person on the couch sometimes, is that if I punch in a stream and I've previously been using the HDMI ARC input, it will automatically cut over to the streaming input and start playing that stream. Now, if I then want to go back to my TV, all I have to do is just pick up my Apple TV remote and start moving it around, and the Sonos AMP cuts back automatically to that HDMI ARC input. And the Bluesounds don't do this. I have to pull up the app and punch in HDMI in the app like an animal. Another thing worth mentioning about the Sonos AMP, well, the Sonos platform in general, is it, I believe, is the only platform or streaming software platform in the world to integrate Apple Music into its app. Now, why that might matter to you, well, it probably comes down to two reasons. Firstly, you might not want to use AirPlay to stream Apple Music because the stream travels through the phone. So you might not want that. The other reason is you might be using Apple Music with Chromecast. And as we know, Chromecast is not gapless. But the Sonos app, when streaming music from Apple Music, it is absolutely 100% gapless. And now we're into streaming differences. Now the Sonos AMP doesn't have the Bluesound's Tidal Connect or its Roon readiness. Yes, we can use Roon to stream directly to, well, any Sonos device. It doesn't just have to be the Sonos AMP. But I don't believe that that system uses Roon's own RAT streaming protocol. Of course, how much that bugs you will really fall to how much of a Roon purist you are. Now, I'm a big Roon user, but I'm not so much of a purist as to reject a streaming situation because it doesn't use Roon RAT. I'm just not. Like, I like to be a bit more pragmatic about this. Now, Sonos, with the AMP, don't seem to be interested in headphone listeners at all. I like to do a bit of both. That for me is where the Bluesound again steps into its own, both the Powernode and the Powernode Edge, because the former has an analog headphone output. The Edge doesn't, but both of them have two-way Bluetooth. So that means we can stream from our phone into the Powernode, into the Powernode Edge. But we can also stream Bluetooth out of those devices again. Now, I should clarify that I don't think there's any advantage in going from your phone, with music that is, into the Powernode or Powernode Edge and then back out to a pair of headphones. That's just crazy. But where I think the Bluetooth output really comes into its own is, let's say we're watching TV late at night. So we want to convert that HDMI eARC input on the Bluesounds into a Bluetooth stream that they can be sent to a pair of headphones, so we can just essentially sit on the couch, enjoy our TV viewing without disturbing anybody else. There is a tiny, tiny lip sync delay when you do this. But for me, I can ignore it, no problem. I mean, if you're really, really super sensitive to these things, then it's probably going to be a no-no for you. But it does exist, but it's nowhere near as bad as I've heard or seen on other devices. While I'm thinking about it, actually, this wasn't in my script. The Sonos AMP has some advanced features in the app that, this has nothing to do with Bluetooth, by the way, this is to do with HDMI ARC or connecting a TV. There are advanced features that allow you to adjust the audio sync. I think there's a slider for that. I haven't had to use it because I get no lip sync error when I'm just using my Samsung frame, HDMI ARC into the amp and then out to the speakers. No problems for me at all, but you might have them. So that extra functionality I think is pretty useful. Now, I just mentioned late night listening. Now, the Sonos AMP has a feature that I really, really wish was in many more products of this type. It's not in the Bluesound, not in the Bluesound yet anyway. I don't know if it's coming, don't ask me, I don't know. But anyway, the problem is this, right, is that when we bring the volume down to a lower level, our hearing, our ear brain becomes less sensitive to bass and treble. So basically what might come across as a sort of flat frequency response at a higher volume, when we bring the volume down, it actually sounds to our ears like this. The bass comes down, the treble comes down. Now you might have seen on sort of vintage amplifiers a button that says loudness. And that was designed to switch on when you were listening at lower volumes. Although my dad had a Sansui with that on it, and I used to whack that on all the time because what it does is it lifts the bass and it lifts the treble. See what I mean? It's good for late night or low volume listening. Now, Sonos do this in software, but what we don't know, or what I don't know, is if the Sonos amp gets to a certain volume and then that loudness setting just sort of clicks in full, or whether it comes in gradually. I don't know. I did try and do some digging on the internet, but I couldn't find any information about this. And I don't know anybody at Sonos to ask, which is why I had to buy this unit. Now, some of the old school hi-fi enthusiasts among you will be wondering right now, what about the Rotel A11 Tribute and how does it sound compared to the Sonos amp? Now, before I talk about sound quality differences, we have to add an external streamer to that Rotel amplifier because we can't access its internal DAC in any other way apart from Bluetooth. So effectively, there's really no DAC inside that I consider to be useful. So we could add the Bluesound Node, but that takes us to, I think, north of £1,000 with our total spend, because the Rotel sells for €600 and I think the Node sells for the same, so it's £1,200. So what I did is I pulled out the Argon.Audio solo streamer that we reviewed a couple of months ago. That's $250. So on a retail level, that brings us to $850, which is kind of closer to the amp. And in terms of sound quality, you could argue, even though it's kind of a close call, you could argue that the Rotel sounds a little bit more relaxed, a little bit richer, a little bit smoother. The Sonos amp, in comparison, I guess sounds a bit cooler and a bit, I don't want to say spikier with details, but it isn't as rounded with details as our sort of Rotel with the third-party streamer. Now, the Rotel also builds in a phono stage. That's pretty good. And if all you ever do is listen to music, then I would definitely recommend going with a Rotel and an external streamer. Now, I don't know many people who kind of go, well, I just want to listen to music and I never watch TV. I know there are some of you out there. I used to be one of those people, actually, but not anymore. And I'm very much into, or very much see the value now of having an HDMI ARC input on the back of an amplifier or back of a pair of speakers. To me, it's essential because I want to route my TV's audio through the same audio system that I play my music through. And I'm sure many of you are the same. And I'm sure many people looking at the kind of products like a Sonos amp, like a Bluesound Powernode, like even a Rotel A11 Tribute, they'll be asking themselves, can I connect my TV to this? And in the case of the Rotel and the external streamer, no. Sonos amp, yes. Bluesound Powernode, yes. Bluesound Powernode Edge, yes. HDMI ARC for me is becoming essential at this price point. I also think the Sonos amp is the more mom and dad friendly device here. I mean, the onboarding with Wi-Fi network and the way that the phone app automatically discovers the device is just fantastic. Bluesound's not far behind, but it's not quite as sort of automagical and as polished as Sonos. So I think if you're terrible with technology, you probably want the Sonos amp. There are all sorts of sort of functional balls to juggle when weighing up the Bluesound or the Sonos amp, and I hope I've covered a lot of them here. You might have to watch this video twice before leaving a comment or asking a question, but I hope this gives you a better insight into how good the Sonos amp is. I must admit, I'm surprised. I thought it would be pretty weak amplifier-wise. It exceeded my expectations because I went in with fairly low expectations with the sound quality of this amp. I could definitely live with it. And if I'd not heard the Bluesounds, I wouldn't be troubled at all by the sound of the Sonos amp, not one bit. But if you are sort of like looking for that last sort of ounce of sound quality, looking to juice the last ounce of sound quality out of your listening situation, I recommend going to a dealer like Hi-Fi Clubben and doing the A/B between the Sonos and the Bluesound, because I don't know of many other dealers that have those two products on the floor. Alternatively, you could buy both on like a home demo situation from your local sort of e-retailer. You could do that, but as I said in the last video, you really have to listen for yourself. But if you're not too worried about those sort of minor deltas in sound quality, you could probably make a call on the functional differences that I've called out today. If you're a turntable listener, sorry, I wouldn't go with the Sonos amp. I really wouldn't. I'd definitely go with the Bluesound here. But yeah, if you're sort of like if you're somebody who listens to 50% music and then 50% TV audio, I think the Sonos amp would be an absolutely fantastic choice. I really do. I think it's a great product. Anyway, if you like this video, please give us a like down below. If you like my attitude towards high-end audio, in that I'm not afraid to look at Sonos, I'm not afraid to praise Sonos. A lot of people like to kick Sonos because it's the incumbent, but I take more of a pragmatic attitude. I really love the Sonos 5s. I made a video about those. I didn't like the Sonos ARC. That's something I haven't mentioned actually in this video. If you're looking at the Sonos ARC as well, please push pause on that idea, because as many of us know who have heard many soundbars, The stereo width you get from a Sonos amp with a pair of passive loudspeakers is far wider and gives you a more enveloping sound than the Sonos Arc soundbar can ever dream of. Yes, it might go lower in the bass. Yes, it does Dolby Atmos, but not very well. See my video for that, for how it kind of truncates the start of a Dolby Atmos stream. Absolute deal breaker. That's kind of like gapped playback for me. But I would urge you, if you're considering a soundbar, please stop. Please, I'm begging you. If you listen to any music at all, get the amp, get the passive speakers. So anyway, if you dig all of that and that kind of assessment, then please consider subscribing to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. If you're wondering about TruePlay, that's Sonos' room correction, it's not available on a Sonos amp when it's connected to a pair of passive loudspeakers. I think there are certain other hardware configurations with Sonos gear that is available, but it's not available here. So I've got no idea what it does because we can't use it with this situation. If you're wondering how the Bluesound Powernode Edge or the Bluesound Powernode compares to the Rotel A11 Tribute and the outboard streamer, sorry, can't tell you. This video is about the Sonos amp. And as I've said kind of subtly at the end of some more recent videos, and I'll say more brutally here, what you see is what you get. The Sonos amp is a small streaming amplifier. Fucking straight first line. Of course, one of the amp's major draw cards is but up top in the uppermost frequencies but it's my job to sort of tease them out, magnify them, oh God. But in this comparative situation, we do, so if you're in that kind of situation where you're like, the power issue might not trouble me too much, then really we need to consider, I made sure I use the same cable for both, and I made sure I use the same cable for all of those connections. Sorry, no, that's not right. And I made sure I use the same type of cable. So what that means for vinyl playback is like we lower the needle and then we hear the needle hit the records groove. I mentioned late night listening. Now, the Sonos amp has a feature that I really wish, let me do that again, sorry. If you're also a headphone listener, as I am, then the Sonos amp won't serve you at all, not at all. But Bluesound, they seem to be more interested in, let me start at the bit again.